The planet Vorin 5 was a graveyard. The sky was painted with fire and smoke, the ground shattered by endless warfare. Lieutenant Jason Rourke moved like a shadow through the ruins, his breathing steady despite the chaos around him. His cloaking device flickered slightly before stabilizing, making him nearly invisible against the scorched metal and crumbled stone. He was alone. His entire squad wiped out in an ambush just 2 days ago, and his only goal now was survival. But survival wasn't easy when the Vorak Empire ruled the battlefield. The Vorak weren't just aliens. They were a nightmare of machines and flesh, ruled by an AI overlord that saw humans as nothing more than a pest to be exterminated. Their soldiers, cybernetic enforcers, were fast, relentless, and heavily armed, and they were hunting him. Jason paused behind a collapsed building, his sharp blue eyes scanning the war-torn landscape. He had maybe half an hour before his stealth suit's power ran out. His anal was low, his body aching from the fight that had killed his team, and extraction was still hours away. But even through the exhaustion, his mind stayed focused. One wrong move, and he was dead. Then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in a place like this. It was faint. A soft, broken cry, almost drowned out by the distant thunder of explosions. Jason froze, listening carefully. It came again, closer this time. A voice, weak and filled with fear. It wasn't human, but the pain in it was unmistakable. Against his better judgment, he moved toward the sound. Slipping through the shadows, he found a half-collapsed structure. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of burned metal, but the sound was clearer now. He crept forward, and his eyes locked onto the source of the voice. She was huddled in the corner, an alien woman, trembling and covered in bruises. Her skin was a soft violet hue, faintly glowing under the dim light, and her silver eyes were wide with terror. A metallic shackle was clamped around her neck, connected to a broken chain, and her delicate face was streaked with dirt and blood. She looked completely helpless. Jason's heart clenched, but he didn't let it distract him. He approached carefully, his weapon raised. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly. Her eyes snapped to him, fear flashing across her face. She tried to scramble back, but her body was too weak, and she collapsed with a choked sob. Please," she whispered in a language his translator implant quickly interpreted. Don't let them take me." Before he could respond, his motion sensor flared to life. Jason spun just in time to see 3 Vorak enforcers closing in, their red mechanical eyes scanning the area. They hadn't seen him yet, but the girl, she was exposed. Jason didn't hesitate. The first Vorak didn't even get a chance to react. Jason's silenced rifle barked once, and the machine alien dropped with a sparking hole through its head. The second turned toward the sound, but Jason was already moving. He slid under its sweeping arm, drove his combat knife into its neck joint, and yanked, severing its power core with a sickening crunch. But the third one spotted the girl. It raised its weapon, an energy blaster humming to life. She screamed, and Jason's shot was the only thing that stopped the Vorak from firing. The alien crumpled, its weapon clattering uselessly to the ground. Jason rushed to her side. "We need to move. Now." She didn't argue. Despite her obvious pain, she pushed herself up, clutching his arm as he guided her out of the building. But the fight had drawn attention. A low mechanical roar filled the air, and when Jason glanced back, his stomach sank. A Vorak drone hovered above the ruins, its scanners locking onto them. "Run," Jason ordered. They sprinted through the ruins, the drone's energy blasts tearing the ground apart behind them. Jason's cloaking device sputtered, struggling to keep up, but it was already too late. They'd been marked. Ahead, more enforcers were closing in. He cursed under his breath. They were surrounded. The girl stumbled, her strength giving out. Jason caught her just as the Vorak forces began to encircle them. His rifle clicked empty. Only his sidearm and knife remained. But he wouldn't leave her behind. "If this is how it ends," he muttered, raising his weapon, "then let's make it hurt." But before the first shot was fired, the girl did something he never expected. She reached out, her eyes glowing brighter, and the air around them shimmered with strange energy. The ground trembled, and in an instant, a shockwave of force erupted from her, sending the Vorak flying like ragdolls. The drone exploded midair, and the battlefield went eerily silent. Jason stared at her, his mind racing to process what just happened. She collapsed against him, her breathing ragged. I didn't want to use it," she whispered weakly. "What the hell are you?" Jason asked, but she had already slipped into unconsciousness. And in the distance, the sound of more Vorak closing in filled the air once more. The small hidden shelter was cold and dark, but it was safe. At least for now. Jason Rourke knelt beside the fragile alien girl, carefully wrapping a thermal blanket around her trembling body. She was still unconscious, her violet skin pale, her breathing shallow. He'd seen enough wounded soldiers in his time to know she wouldn't last long without help. "Come on, stay with me," he murmured, setting up a field med kit. He worked quickly, treating the bruises and burns across her body, his hands gentle despite the urgency. When he reached the shackle around her neck, his jaw clenched. The Vorak had treated her like an animal. He pulled out his combat knife, working on the lock. It finally snapped off with a sharp hiss, and the sight of her unmarked throat made his chest ache with a strange kind of relief. Hours passed. Outside, the distant sounds of the Vorak hunting party faded, but Jason remained on high alert. He sat near the entrance of the shelter, his rifle across his lap, his eyes never resting for long. He told himself he was only protecting an innocent, but every time he glanced back at her, something about her made him feel protective. When she finally stirred, her eyes fluttering open, Jason moved to her side immediately. "Hey," he said softly, "you're safe now." Her silver eyes focused on him, wide and uncertain. You didn't leave me." Jason huffed a quiet, tired laugh. "Not my style." He offered her a water canteen, watching as she sipped carefully. "What's your name?" "Ziara," she whispered, her voice soft and musical. "Thank you for saving me." The way she looked at him, like he was something good in a world full of monsters, made his chest tighten. "You're welcome," he said gruffly, trying to shake the feeling. "Now tell me, Ziara, who did this to you?" Her expression darkened, her delicate features tightening with pain. "The Vorak," she said, her voice trembling. They destroyed my people, betrayed us. We thought we were safe under their protection, but it was a lie. They attacked without warning. My family, my entire colony. Her voice broke, and she looked away, tears glinting in her eyes. Jason's hand clenched around his knee. He knew the Vorak were ruthless, but the sheer devastation she described struck a nerve. "You're the last survivor?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "As far as I know, yes." The silence between them stretched, heavy and full of grief. But then Zara looked back at him, and there was something else in her gaze, something fragile but determined. "Why did you help me?" she asked softly. Jason shrugged, trying to downplay it. "Because it was the right thing to do." For the first time, she smiled, small and fleeting, but real. And in that moment, Jason realized just how beautiful she was. As the hours passed, Zara grew stronger. She was still weak, but the color began returning to her violet skin, and her fear slowly eased in his presence. They talked in quiet moments, and she told him more about her people, the Ilari, a peaceful race known for their advanced energy manipulation abilities. The Vorak had seen them as a threat, wiping them out with brutal efficiency. Jason taught her how to defend herself. They didn't have much time, but he showed her the basics of handling a weapon, how to stay low and move quietly. She wasn't a natural fighter. Her movements were hesitant, her hands trembling. But she listened, and she learned. In those stolen moments, something began to shift between them. The way she looked at him, the way her hand lingered just a second longer when he guided her movements. Jason tried to ignore it, but the connection was undeniable. It didn't last. The attack came without warning. The first explosion rocked the shelter, sending debris raining down around them. Jason was on his feet in an instant, pulling Zyra behind him as Vorak enforcers swarmed the entrance. He fired with deadly precision, dropping two before the rest returned fire. Energy bolts scorched the walls, and the air filled with the sound of battle. "Stay close," he shouted, pushing forward. Zyra followed without hesitation, her eyes wide but focused. They fought their way through the ruins, Jason's movements sharp and efficient. He took down enemies with brutal efficiency, his knife flashing as he engaged in close combat. But there were too many. A Vorak drone appeared overhead, its targeting systems locking onto Zyra. Jason threw himself in front of her as the energy blast fired, the shockwave sending them both crashing to the ground. Pain exploded through his side, but he forced himself up. "Run," he shouted, dragging Zyra with him. They stumbled through the ruins, blaster fire raining down around them. Jason's stealth device flickered, struggling to keep them hidden. And then the Vorak commander appeared. A massive, heavily armored figure with glowing red eyes and a crackling energy weapon. It didn't attack immediately. It just stood there, watching them. "Give us the girl," it said in a voice cold and mechanical, "and you may live." Jason raised his weapon. "Not gonna happen." The commander didn't react. It didn't need to. The drone above charged its weapon, and Jason knew they were out of time. But before it could fire, Zyra stepped forward, her eyes blazing with light. "No," Jason shouted, but it was too late. The air around her shimmered with energy, and the ground shook beneath them. A wave of force erupted from her, knocking the drone out of the sky and sending the commander crashing into the ruins. The battle was over in seconds, but the truth, that was just beginning. Jason turned to her, his heart pounding. What the hell was that? Zyra looked away, her face pale and frightened. I didn't want you to find out this way." "Find out what?" he demanded. She hesitated, her voice trembling when she finally spoke. "I'm not just an Ilari survivor," she said softly. "I'm the heir to the Ilari royal bloodline. The Vorak didn't just destroy my people. They're hunting me. They won't stop until I'm dead or captured." Jason stared at her, his mind racing. The weight of her words settled heavily on him. They weren't just running from the Vorak. They were running from an empire that would stop at nothing to capture its last remaining princess. And suddenly, their fight for survival had become so much more dangerous. The forest stretched endlessly ahead, dense and wild, offering them some cover. But not enough. Ethan moved quickly, his eyes constantly scanning the trees, his weapon ready. Behind him, Zyra kept pace, her breathing light but steady. She was faster now, more confident, and it wasn't just the training. Something had changed between them since she revealed the truth. The air was thick with tension, but neither of them spoke. They'd been running for hours, and the silence felt safer than words. Finally, Ethan slowed, signaling for her to stop. "We need to rest," he said, his voice low. Zyra nodded, though her eyes stayed on the shadows around them. Even now, she was learning, staying alert, watching his every move. They settled near a fallen tree, and Ethan handed her his canteen. She took a sip, her fingers brushing his, and for a moment, the world narrowed to that single touch. "Ethan," she said quietly, "how much farther?" "Not far," he lied. He didn't know if they'd ever be far enough. The Vorak wouldn't stop, not until they had her. She saw through the lie, but didn't call him on it. Instead, she looked down at the weapon in her lap, a small blaster he'd taught her to use. "Thank you for teaching me," she said, "for staying." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the softness in her voice. "You're a quick learner." Her eyes met his, silver and unreadable. You didn't have to save me. You didn't have to stay. But you did. Why? He didn't have an answer, not one he could admit. So instead, he reached for the blaster. Show me, he said. Safety off. Finger steady. Aim for the center. Syra's eyes flickered with something. Determination, maybe even a little pride. She rose smoothly, her stance already better than the first time they practiced. She fired, the shot hitting dead center on a tree trunk. Ethan smiled despite himself. Not bad. Hours passed, and the sun dipped low. They moved again, deeper into the wilderness. Ethan pushed them hard, knowing the Vorak were closing in. They camped only when exhaustion made it unavoidable. And through it all, Syra grew stronger. She moved quieter, aimed faster, fought harder. But it was her spirit that surprised him most. The quiet fierceness, the way she refused to break. One night, as they sat by a small fire, Ethan finally let his guard down. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. She tilted her head. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. Someone scared, broken. He looked at her, the fire casting shadows across her face. "But you're not." "I was," she said softly. "Before you." The words hit him harder than they should have, but before he could respond, the sound of branches snapping had him on his feet, weapon drawn. Syra followed without hesitation, the fire already snuffed out. They moved into the darkness, silent and ready. But they weren't ready enough. The attack came fast, too fast. Vorak bounty hunters burst from the trees, their armored forms blending with the night. Ethan fired first, taking down one. But there were too many. Energy bolts filled the air, and they dove for cover behind a rocky outcrop. "Stay down," Ethan ordered, his voice tight. "I can fight," Syra argued, but he was already moving. He took out another Vorak with a well-placed shot, then spun as one closed in, blades flashing. The fight was brutal, fast, violent. Ethan's knife found the Vorak's throat, but not before pain exploded through his side. He staggered back, his vision blurring. "Ethan." Syra's voice was distant, panicked. He tried to rise, but the world tilted. And then everything changed. The air crackled with energy, and Syra stepped forward, no weapon in her hands, but something far more dangerous. Her eyes blazed with silver light, and the ground shook beneath them. "Enough," she whispered. The burst of power was like nothing Ethan had ever seen. The forest erupted in light, and the Vorak screamed, but only for a moment. When the light faded, they were gone, every one of them. Ethan stared at her, his mind struggling to catch up. What was that? Syra turned, and the light in her eyes dimmed. But the fear there wasn't for their enemies, it was for him. "I never wanted you to see that," she whispered. He pushed himself up, wincing. "You said you were powerful. You didn't say you could do that." She looked away, "Because I don't know how to control it. And if the Vorak find out," she didn't finish. She didn't have to. Ethan's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the realization that the girl he'd been protecting might just be the most dangerous thing on this planet. And the Vorak wouldn't stop until they had her. The night felt colder after what happened. The air was heavy with the scent of scorched trees and the quiet aftermath of destruction. Ethan's side ached with every step, but he kept moving, leading Syra through the dense forest. She walked in silence, her face pale and unreadable, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the fear she was trying to hide. They didn't stop until they reached a small clearing near a stream. Ethan finally sank to the ground, leaning against a tree, his hand pressing against the wound on his side. Syra knelt beside him immediately, her touch gentle but urgent. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice thick with worry. "It's not bad," he lied, even as the pain flared. "We'll keep moving soon. The Vorak will regroup." But Syra wasn't listening. She pulled a small medical kit from their supplies and started tending to his wound. Her hands were careful, but Ethan could feel her shaking. "You didn't tell me," he said softly, watching her face, "about your powers." She froze for a second, then kept working. "I didn't want you to be afraid of me," she whispered. "I'm not." The words came easily because they were true. Whatever she was, whatever she could do, Ethan had seen her kindness, her courage. He didn't fear her. He feared what the Vorak would do if they caught her. When she finished, she sat back, wrapping her arms around her knees. The firelight flickered across her face, making her look smaller and more fragile than she was. "I didn't always have this power," she said after a long silence. "It awakened when my family was betrayed, when they were killed. I didn't know how to control it. I still don't." Ethan stayed quiet, letting her speak. "The Vorak call me a weapon," she whispered. "That's why they want me. Not because of who I am, but because of what I can do. And if they take me," her voice broke, "they'll use me to destroy entire worlds." The fear in her voice twisted something inside him. He shifted closer, ignoring the pain in his side. "You're not a weapon, Sira. You're a survivor. You're a fighter. And you're not alone." She looked at him then, her silver eyes filled with uncertainty. "You don't understand what I am, what I could become." "Then show me," he said gently. "Let me help you." Her breath caught, but before she could answer, the distant sound of engines rumbled through the night. Ethan's head snapped up. "They're coming." They moved quickly, packing their supplies and heading deeper into the forest. Ethan's mind raced. They were close to a human outpost, one that could offer them safety. But the Vorak were closing in fast. Every instinct told him they wouldn't make it without a fight. They traveled through the night and into the morning, stopping only when exhaustion forced them to. As they rested, Sira finally broke the silence. "I'm afraid of my power," she admitted quietly. "Every time I use it, I lose a part of myself. It's like something else takes over, and I don't know if I can stop it." Ethan studied her for a long moment. "Then we'll find a way," he said simply. "Together." Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she smiled. It was small, tentative, but it was real. They kept moving, and by midday, the outpost was in sight, a fortified structure rising from the rocky landscape. Relief flooded Ethan's chest. "We're almost there." But the feeling didn't last. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and a deafening roar filled the air. Ethan spun just in time to see the Vorak strike fleet descending from the sky. Ships filled the horizon, sleek and deadly, their weapons already glowing with energy. "They found us," Sira whispered, her face pale. "Run." Ethan grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the outpost. But the Vorak were faster. Fighters swooped overhead, their cannons blasting the ground behind them. Explosions tore through the earth, and Ethan shielded Sira with his body as debris rained down. They reached the outpost's outer defenses just as the first wave of Vorak troops landed. Ethan pushed Sira behind a barricade, firing his weapon with practiced precision. Energy bolts filled the air, and the ground shook with the impact of artillery fire. "We can't hold them off," Sira shouted over the noise. "We don't have to," Ethan yelled back. "We just need to get inside." But the Vorak were everywhere, closing in fast. Ethan's weapon overheated, and he switched to his knife as a Vorak soldier lunged at him. They fought viciously, and Ethan barely managed to drive the blade home. And then he heard Sira scream. He turned, and his heart stopped. She stood in the open, her arms raised, her eyes glowing with that terrible silver light. Energy crackled around her, and the air itself seemed to hum with power. But this time, there was no control. "Sira." "No." Ethan ran toward her, but it was too late. The power exploded outward, a blinding wave of destruction that tore through the Vorak ranks. Ships fell from the sky, and soldiers disintegrated where they stood. But Sira didn't stop. The power kept building, and Ethan saw the fear on her face, the terror of losing herself. "Let me go," she cried. "If I surrender, They'll stop. They'll take me and leave you alone. No. Ethan's voice was fierce, desperate. He reached her, grabbing her shoulders. You are not theirs to take. Tears streamed down her face. They'll kill you. Then they'll have to go through me first, he said. I'm not leaving you, Sira. I never will. For a heartbeat, the world held still, and then, slowly, the power began to fade. The light dimmed, and Sira collapsed into his arms. The Vorak ships were gone, their forces decimated, but the fight wasn't over. Ethan held Sira tightly, his heart pounding. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't let her face it alone. The air smelled of ash and burning metal, thick and suffocating. The ground trembled with the force of distant explosions, and the sky was lit with fire and falling ships. Ethan gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles white, as the Vorak closed in from all sides. Their numbers were endless. Soldiers in gleaming black armor, their weapons glowing with lethal energy. Behind him, Sira knelt on the rocky ground, her eyes closed, her hands pressed together as she gathered her strength. The air around her shimmered, rippling with a strange, dangerous energy. But she needed time, and time was running out. Ethan wouldn't let them reach her. He fired into the advancing Vorak line, his shots precise and deadly. Soldiers fell, but more kept coming. He ducked behind a twisted piece of wreckage as return fire screamed past him, the heat searing his skin. His muscles burned with exhaustion, his side throbbed from his earlier wound, but he forced himself to keep moving. A Vorak soldier vaulted over the debris, its blade slashing down. Ethan spun, the knife in his hand a blur as he drove it into the alien's throat. The soldier collapsed, but there was no time to breathe. Another was already there. Ethan fought like a man possessed, his body moving on instinct, his vision narrowed to the single goal of keeping Sira safe. Ethan. Sira's voice broke through the chaos. I need more time. Then you'll get it, he shouted back, his voice hoarse. He surged forward, meeting the Vorak head-on. He slammed the butt of his rifle into one's helmet, kicked another's legs out from under them. His knife flashed, his shots rang out, but they were too many. A plasma bolt grazed his arm, and the pain was a white-hot brand. But still, he didn't stop. A Vorak captain stepped forward, towering over the others. Its armor gleamed with dark energy, and it raised a massive weapon Ethan had never seen before. The barrel glowed, charging, and Ethan knew he wouldn't survive that shot. But he didn't back down. He raised his rifle, and the Vorak fired. The blast was blinding. Ethan braced himself, but the impact never came. Instead, a wall of shimmering energy exploded between them, deflecting the shot into the sky. He turned, and his breath caught. Sira stood, her eyes glowing with silver fire, her hair rising around her like it was caught in a storm. The air rippled with power, and the ground cracked beneath her feet. She raised one hand, and the Vorak captain was lifted into the air, struggling against an invisible force. You will not take me, Sira said, her voice resonating with terrible strength, and you will not harm him. With a flick of her wrist, the captain was thrown backward, slamming into a pile of wreckage with a sickening crunch. But the effort cost her. Sira swayed, the glow dimming for a moment, and the Vorak pressed their attack. Ethan rushed to her side. We have to move. No, she whispered, her voice strained. I'm almost ready. But the Vorak weren't going to wait. A wave of soldiers charged, weapons blazing. Ethan pushed Sira behind him, his rifle barking fire, but there were too many. A plasma bolt slammed into his leg, and he dropped to one knee with a cry of pain. Still, he fought. He fought because there was no other choice. Ethan. Sira's scream was full of terror, and something inside him broke. He surged up, ignoring the pain, and met the Vorak head-on. He fought with everything he had, a whirlwind of desperation and fury. His knife found flesh, his fists broke bone, but still they came. A heavy blow sent him sprawling, and the world tilted sideways. He saw the Vorak closing in on Sira, saw her eyes widen in fear, and he knew he wouldn't reach her in time. But then the air exploded with light. Sira rose into the air, her body surrounded by a storm of silver energy. The ground buckled, and the Vorak froze, their weapons raised but useless. She spread her arms, and the world shattered. A wave of power erupted from her, tearing through the enemy ranks. Ships fell from the sky, their engines failing. Soldiers were thrown like ragdolls, their armor cracking under the force. The ground itself split, and the air hummed with a terrible, beautiful sound. Ethan tried to stand, but his strength was gone. He watched as Sira unleashed her full fury, her face a mask of pain and determination. The Vorak were wiped out, their forces broken in an instant. But the cost was high. The light faded. Sira collapsed, falling like a broken star, and Ethan caught her as the darkness took him. The world was a blur of pain and fading light. Ethan felt the cold creeping in, his body broken and battered. Every breath was a struggle, shallow and weak, and the distant sound of battle had faded into an eerie silence. He knew he was dying. He could feel it. But then there was warmth. A gentle, radiant warmth that pushed back the cold. A soft touch brushed against his face, and through the haze, he heard a voice. "Ethan, stay with me. Please. Sira." He forced his eyes open and saw her kneeling beside him, her face pale and streaked with tears. The silver glow that had once been so fierce now flickered like a dying flame around her. She pressed her hands over his wounds, and the warmth grew stronger, flowing through him like liquid light. "You don't have to do this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I do," she said, her voice trembling. "I won't let you die." The air around them shimmered as she poured what little strength she had left into him. Ethan felt the pain ease, the warmth knitting his broken body back together, but he could see the toll it was taking on her. Her hands shook, her breathing grew ragged, and the light around her dimmed with every second. "Stop, Sira, stop," he begged, his heart breaking at the sight of her. "You'll kill yourself." But she didn't stop. "You saved me," she whispered, her eyes filled with fierce determination. "Every time. You stood between me and death without a second thought. Now it's my turn." Ethan tried to move, but his limbs were still too weak. He could only watch as Sira's strength faded, her skin growing paler, her body trembling from the effort. And then, finally, she collapsed beside him, the last of her power spent. For a long moment, there was only silence. But then, in the distance, the roar of engines filled the air. Human ships broke through the clouds, descending on the battlefield with blinding lights and the thunder of weapons. Reinforcements had arrived. Ethan forced himself up, his body still aching, but no longer broken. He gathered Sira into his arms, her body limp and cold, and held her close as human soldiers poured onto the field. Medics rushed to his side, voices shouting, but he only had eyes for her. "Stay with me, Sira," he whispered. "Please." The journey back to the human outpost was a blur. The medics worked on Sira, their faces grim, but Ethan never left her side. He held her hand, his heart pounding with fear, and prayed she'd open her eyes. When she finally did, it felt like the sun breaking through the storm. "You're okay," he breathed, his voice choked with relief. She gave him a weak smile. "I told you, I wouldn't let you die." The days that followed were filled with chaos and celebration. Word of Sira's power and her courage spread quickly. The soldiers hailed her not just as a survivor, but as a hero. They called her the savior of Bastion, the alien girl who had wiped out an entire Vorak strike force with a single burst of energy. But Sira didn't care about the titles or the attention. The only thing she cared about was him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they stood together on a quiet balcony overlooking the outpost. The air was cool and still, the sounds of celebration distant. You never needed me to save you, Ethan said quietly, his eyes on the horizon. Sarah turned to him, her gaze soft. Maybe not, she admitted, but I needed you to see me. Not as a weapon, not as a prize, just me. He looked at her then, really looked at her, at the fierce, brave, beautiful woman who had fought beside him, bled beside him, and nearly died to save him. And in that moment, he knew his life would never be the same. Stay, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Stay with me. Her smile was like the dawn breaking. I thought you'd never ask.